Hello everyone. This is a short video going over some of the structures that we would usually be going over in our lab of the reproductive system. Obviously we can't be in the lab right now, so we're kind of forced to do it this way. But just like I would in the lab, I like to go over a couple of the main structures just to give you some pointers. So here we go. We'll start with the male and then we'll talk about the female. Here's a listing of the structures that you need to be responsible for the male reproductive system. As you know, you have your lab objective sheet, so make sure you're paying attention to what structures are on the objective sheet. These pictures will show you many more structures that you don't have to know. So focus on what's on your objective sheet, which for most of you in this lab are the structures on the left. Let's go one at a time. Okay, for the male, we first talk about the external structures known as the testes. You can use my little pen here. So, hanging outside of the body, because sperm production is best maximized at a slightly cooler temperature than the internal part of the body, are the testes. Inside the testes, if we were to take an inside view, inside the testes, we see all these coils, and these coils are called the seminiferous tubules. It is in these coils that the testes are able to produce sperm. What is the benefit of having all these coils, right? In other words, instead of just having a row of cells, we have many, many coils. And if you've had A and P with me, or pretty much anybody, you know that that's a way to increase surface area. So by having the coil formation, we can increase surface area and do more sperm production. The pouch that holds the testes is called the scrotum. So I think a good word would be pouch, okay? So the pouch that holds the testes is the scrotum. There's a spermatic cord that's going to contain a bundle of arteries, nerves, veins, and lymphatics. But these are important structures, the testes, as they produce sperm. That's vital for reproduction. So because they're important, we have an outer pouch called the scrotum. In terms of the male, if you look at the reproductive anatomy, it's kind of simple. And that's not a judgment on males being simple. But in terms of the anatomy, there's really only two things that the males have to do in terms of reproduction, and that means produce the sperm. So as we just said, the sperm is produced in the seminiferous tubules of the testes. Then we've got to get that sperm up into the body, and that sperm gets up into the body through a series of ducts, and then it continues through the body, and at the right time, if we want, we can ejaculate that fluid and impregnate a female. That's really the function of the male. We talked about the testes and the production of sperm in the seminiferous tubules. The next part would be the ducts. We've got to get that sperm up into the body so then it can be ejected through the penis. The structures that are on most of your sheets would be the epididymis. The epididymis is this little worm-like structure, and the epididymis stores sperm. Because sperm isn't always traveling up into the body. Sperm is only traveling up into the body during ejaculation. So if there's no ejaculation, the sperm is stored in the epididymis. When there is ejaculation, the sperm is going to leave the epididymis and travel up through the ductus deferens, or vas deferens. You may have heard it as vas deferens. And the ductus deferens lead us all the way up here, through an ejaculatory duct down towards the penis. So make sure you review the order of structures that sperm travels through. It's important to point out here, if we look at the terminal point here, so in this picture we can see the male urethra, which is, of course, the central passageway through the penis. And what's unique about the male and different from the female is that at different times, we can have sperm coming through the urethra, or we could have urine coming through the urethra. So depending on the situation, the male urethra is a passageway for both. During ejaculation, it will be sperm coming through via the passageway that we just talked about. But what if there's no ejaculation and instead the male simply wants to excrete urine? In that case, the urine, which is going to be coming from the kidneys down the ureter into the bladder, then that urine can come through the urethra as well. At different times, of course. Here's a side view, a lateral view that we can see. And in that lateral view, we can see the urethra. And again, the urethra will convey semen or urine at different times. Okay. Now, if I go back to this picture, which I kind of like better, even though there's a bunch of stuff on it, let's go back to black. As sperm leaves the testes and comes up the ductus deferens, one of the reasons why we bring it through the body is because it passes through a series of glands. There's a series of glands here. There's a gland here on both sides, and there's some smaller glands here. And the function of these glands, what leaves the testes is only sperm, but once it goes through those glands, now it becomes semen. And that's what is actually excreted. I really should have semen here instead of sperm. Let's talk about those glands. We have 3 of them. Seminal vesicles. These are pretty large. Let's go back to this view. The seminal vesicles are these big ones up here. There's one on this side and one on this side. This is going to be the first gland that the sperm travels through. You see I have a 2 here because the seminal vesicles are paired. Each gland gives a different function, ultimately to form semen. They each provide something different to the table, which is more of a physiology discussion. But for the anatomy, let's just know that the seminal vesicles, I prefer this picture. The seminal vesicles are the first ones that the sperm is going to go through, and they're very large and they're paired. The next one is going to be the prostate. Everyone's heard of the prostate. The prostate is one single gland, but it has 2 halves. There's 1 half on this side and 1 half on that side, separated by the urethra. Let's check out the other view here. We can see the prostate. The prostate gland here, we can see it's kind of a big walnut shape, 1 half on this side of the urethra and 1 half on the other side of the urethra. So the semen is first going to travel nearby the seminal vesicles. Then it will go through the prostate gland, which leads us lastly to the smallest of the glands, which is the bulbourethral glands. These actually are paired. Let me put a 2 there. These are the smallest bulbourethral glands. There's one on this side, one on this side. Excellent. So 3 glands. In terms of the penis itself, the only thing that I think is on most of your objective sheets would be the glands of the penis. And that's just basically the outer tip where it gets a little bit thicker. This is kind of a cool view so you can see how vascular the penis is and how it's separated into 3 different sections if you were to cross-section it. All right, let's talk about the female reproductive system. Unlike the male, the female reproductive system has many more functions to do. Not only is this system responsible for producing the sex cells for the female and the sex hormones for the female, but this is also responsible for receiving the sperm, fertilizing the egg, and then nourishing that developing zygote, which becomes a fetus, for 9 months, and then pushing the fetus out of the body. And then, not only that, after birth, this system is also responsible for producing milk in the mammary glands. So The anatomy reflects that. The anatomy for the female is more complex, simply because the female has many more jobs to do. Okay, and here's what I just said. More complex than male for all of these reasons. We'll start with some basic organs. We have the ovaries. So here's more or less an anterior view up top, and the ovary would be these yellow paired organs. The ovaries are going to be the site of egg production. They're held in place by ligaments. An up-close look at the bottom left here, if you were to take an up-close look at the ovary, that's what it would look like. From a lateral view, in the lateral view, it's the uterus that kind of looks most facing the biggest structure you see, but we can see one of the ovaries hanging out from the side there. In lecture, you'll probably talk about the egg development. The egg cell is called the oocyte, and as it is developed in the ovary, it has a protective outer sac. And those protective outer sacs are called the follicles. And based on the time of the month, we have different sizes and structures of follicles. So inside here, we see these yellow gals. They're the developing oocyte, as it's labeled there. Over time, the oocyte gets bigger, but egg production is much more, I can't find the word right now. Egg production is much more fragile than sperm production. We have plenty of these seminiferous tubules, plenty of cells to produce sperm in the male, but in the female, we only produce 1 egg per ovary per month, and it's a much more fragile process. So as we have a developing oocyte, we definitely want to have an outer sac that is protecting it. At first, the first outer sacs are called primary follicles. They tend to be more of a cuboidal tissue. And as the ovarian cycle continues, the sac gets bigger. And as the sac gets bigger, it becomes a secondary follicle, where instead of it just being smaller cuboidal cells that make up that outer sac, there's more of a stratified tissue, sometimes called a granulosa cell. And the secondary follicle plays more of a role in helping to guide the oocyte in its development. And right before we have ovulation or release, the last phase would be a mature follicle. Another name for that would be a vesicular follicle. And one of the giveaways for that is that there's a larger amount of fluid on the inside, which is helping to guide development even more. The first half here, if I were to break this ovary in half, this first half is the first part of the ovarian cycle. Let's say it's days 1 through, 13 or something. So days 1 through 13, the ovary is functioning more to develop that oocyte. And then right in the middle of the monthly cycle, around day 14, we have ovulation. And ovulation is when that mature egg is released. Which means that the second half of the month, by the way, the first couple phases here, the first 13 days or so is called the follicular phase. Why is it called the follicular phase? Because the follicles are guiding development of the oocyte. Whereas the remaining days, maybe days 15 through 28 or so, this is called the luteal phase. And in the second half of the month, the ovary develops a structure called the corpus luteum. It's yellow shown here. So the function of the ovary in the second half of the sexual cycle of the month is to produce the corpus luteum, and this is what's going to be what produces and releases the sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So the ovary is oh so important. Coming up from the ovary, we have the uterine tubes, otherwise known as the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes, it's a big long tube. This is what's going to carry the egg from the ovary into the uterus, which is right here. This happens to be the site of fertilization. So if there is sperm that comes up, and if the sperm is to fertilize the egg, it's going to happen along the uterine tube. This is not where we want to actually have the zygote develop. We want the zygote and fetus to develop inside the uterus, but it is in the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes that the egg and the sperm actually meet and fertilize. Make sure you review some of the specialized parts of the uterine tubes. We have these fimbriae. You can see there's some finger-like extensions dangling down from the end of the uterine tubes. And those finger-like extensions are called fimbriae. This is an example of what makes egg production and this whole production in the female so fragile. Once the egg is produced, the fimbriae more or less have to catch it. They have sticky little finger-like extensions, and as the egg is released, it is the job of the fimbriae to basically catch and then bring in that egg. The isthmus happens to be the region of the uterine tube closest to the uterus. The inner lining of the uterine tube has long cilia, oftentimes pseudostratified ciliated columnar, which helps in ciliary motion to push the egg along the uterine tube and towards the uterus. Which brings us to the uterus. The uterus is pear-shaped, this whole thing, uterus. This is what's going to receive the fertilized egg, and if the egg is fertilized, then the fertilized egg will implant on the inside lining of the uterus, and that's where the fetus will develop. Some other things to point out about the uterus. It has different regions. The top hump here is called the fundus. If you think back to the digestive system, there was a fundus of the stomach, and it had a similar look to it. It was the hump part. So the fundus of the uterus is the top hump part, and then the body is the middle part. The most distal portion of the uterus is the cervix, and the cervix is basically where the uterus meets the vagina. If a pregnant woman is in labor and they're talking about the cervix dilating, this opening has to get bigger because they're about to push a baby out. And there's a real human cadaver uterus down below. It's also important to make sure that you review the specific structures of the uterine wall. The inner lining of the uterine wall is called the endometrium. The inner lining. The endometrium, or the inner lining, this is where, as I just said, the fertilized egg will implant, if there is a fertilized egg. The middle region, which is very thick, is called the myometrium. And this thick muscular myometrium is needed during childbirth. If we're going to have to push a baby out, we better have some thick muscle in the uterine wall. And the outermost layer is called the perimetrium. It's not labeled as well here, but just the outer layer there is called the perimetrium. Leading off the uterus, here's a nice lateral view. Leading from the uterus, which is right here, we have the vagina. It is the birth canal. So when a baby's being born, then the baby is going to come out in that direction. But what if we're way before in that process and we're at copulation? The vagina is also going to be an area to receive the penis. This is a nice lateral view to show you some of the structures. Because there's a lot going on here. So as we said, this is the uterus. Then coming down is the vagina. But everything's kind of squished together. Anterior to that, we have the bladder. And then we have the urethra, which is different from the female from the male, because the male had a combined urethra that served both a urinary and a reproductive function. But here in the female, the urethra in the front is only a urinary function. And then, of course, posteriorly, we're going to have the very end of the large intestine, the rectum, and then the anus for the release of fecal matter. These structures are not on your list. Just wanted to include it here in case you had any questions. The female has some additional external structures. The mammary glands, so as we said, the job of the female is not limited to the reproductive organs that are in the lower part of the abdominal cavity. In the female, the mammary glands become very important. They're actually present in both sexes, but only really utilized in the female. So the mammary glands are located inside the breast. And of course, the breast is going to be held into place by suspensory ligaments. These mammary glands are surrounded by a lot of adipose tissue for protection. And here's a sagittal view. All right, that concludes the introduction to the anatomy. Good luck with everything.